Hey Cloud Gurus, and welcome to this episode of Azure This Week. In this episode, we're going to take a look at two recent public preview announcements: Azure AD Conditional Access for blocking legacy authentication and backup for SQL Server instances running on Azure VMs. We'll also take a look at the updates included in the newest API release for Azure Container Instances and the announcement that Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS, is now generally available. Let's take a look at the public preview of Azure AD Conditional Access for blocking legacy authentication. If you've not already used Azure AD Conditional Access, it's an Azure AD service which is part of the premium SKU and which enables you to define and enforce controls over the identities in your Azure AD tenant. So as an example, you might enable multi-factor authentication for all users in your Azure AD tenant, but only enforce the second factor when a user attempts to log in from an external IP address off the corporate network. Or you could enforce multi-factor authentication for a specific set of applications which contain sensitive data, so that users are always challenged with the second authentication factor. Now, you can use conditional access to block authentication attempts made using legacy authentication methods like IMAP or SMTP, or older applications like Office 2010, which don't support modern interactive authentication methods. Up to now, if you wanted to block these authentication methods, you'd have to use ADFS. Now that it's supported in Azure AD, you can manage the entire thing centrally and potentially move away from ADFS. Next, let's have a look at the announcement that Azure Backup for SQL Server is now in public preview. To avoid confusion, let me clarify that Azure SQL and Azure SQL Managed Instances already have backup and restore capabilities built into the platform. This new service addresses instances of SQL Server which you have installed on an Azure VM. Now you have access to a service which is managed from the Azure Recovery Vault itself. You use the Vault to discover SQL Server instances which have been installed on Azure VMs, configure a backup and retention policy, and that's kind of pretty much it. So you can set up an entire end-to-end process without needing to directly interact with the SQL Server instance itself. This service performs transaction log backups every 15 minutes, and you can perform a point-in-time restore on a database to a specific second. Billing is pay-as-you-go based on monthly consumption. You can read more about the service right here, including a short video on how to set everything up. The newest API for Azure Container Instances has been released, 01/06/2018, and this contains some new functionality. Multi-container deployments, which you can define as a YAML file and deploy using Azure CLI, passing secrets to the containers by using secure volume so that you don't need to include secrets within the containers themselves, liveness probes or health probes, which let you define under what health conditions or lack of health the container should be restarted, and centralized logging from the container to Azure Log Analytics simply by including the workspace ID and key. While we're talking about containers, Azure Kubernetes Service, or AKS, has finally gone GA. This service has been expanded to 5 new Azure regions, so AKS is now currently available in the US, Europe, and Australia. There will be new regions added in the coming months. Microsoft has got behind Kubernetes in a big way, and it's not just AKS. Support for Kubernetes on Azure has been around for some time in Azure Container Services and ACS Engine, and Microsoft has invested a lot into open source tools to help developers get up and running with Kubernetes quickly, including Helm, Draft, and Brigade, as well as native tools with CI/CD platforms like VSTS and Jenkins, and Kubernetes plugins for VS Code and Visual Studio. That's it for this episode of Azure This Week, where we looked at the public previews of Azure AD Conditional Access to block legacy authentication and Azure Backup Service for SQL Server instances, the latest functionality added to Azure Container Instances, and the GA announcement of Azure Kubernetes Service. Until next week, keep being awesome, Cloud Gurus.